This time of year, as fall is approaching, a lot of us are starting to think about planting bulbs that would come out in the spring. And so we decided that maybe we should talk about how to select those bulbs. You're not going to be planting them yet, but you need to start thinking about selection if you already haven't. So when we talk about fall planting for spring flowering bulbs, these are the bulbs that we're talking about. So it's anywhere from tulips and hyacinths, daffodils, tulips, alliums, all of these that are pictured here are considered fall planted and spring blooming bulbs. And so that's what we're going to talk about. So the big thing about when you want to select any of these is you want to do your homework. There are scads and scads of companies out there. There's lots of different bulbs, lots of different varieties. You can get simple ones, you can get fancy ones. So lots of selection out there. The big thing is do your homework. I know when I flip through those beautiful catalogs, you start having to look at the zones, or at least I try to pay attention to the zones, because we cannot grow anything normally, or it won't overwinter if we get into 7, 8, 9, or 10. So you got to really watch that. Most of Missouri is in 6 or 5. And so you can grow 6 below, 6 and below. In my area up north, maybe in Kirksville, you might be able to do 5 and below. So pay attention to those zones. Pay attention to plant placement, whether it's going to be sun or shade where you're wanting to put these. Think about the soil type. Most of these bulbs are a fleshy bulb. And so they do not do well in heavy moisture soils or heavy clay soils. And so think about an area that needs to be well drained. Think about the plant traits that you want out of these bulbs: tall, short, color, whether it's going to make a big impact or it's going to be small. Think about that bulb source. I know I just mentioned it, but sources do matter. There are companies out there that are well known for providing very good bulbs, and there's others that are known for producing poor bulbs. So do your homework. And you can also get bulbs locally, but I would find out where they're getting them from, how long they've been sitting there, so on and so forth. Big thing is select only healthy bulbs. Of course, when you're ordering online, how do you know they're healthy? You won't know until they come in. And so think about also how much you want to spend, because some of these bulbs can get pretty expensive. For example, on the alliums, the bigger the allium ball, and that's the allium is pictured on this slide, you can get a 3 to 5 inch ball in diameter, and they're going to run you $2.50 to $5 a piece, just depending on the variety. So you can have a lot of money invested in some. Others will be pretty cheap. You might pay 20 cents, 50 cents, up to $1 on some of them. So that's why I'm saying shop around, take a look around, take a look at some of the catalogs. The other thing is when you're picking these bulbs, think about where you're going to put them, and think about that color combination that you want. I know that some people like the red and yellow combination or the purple and yellow combination. And so when you go looking at these catalogs or websites, think about those colors and think about what's opposite or complementary. There are lots of bulb mixes that you can already get pre-selected on colors, and it's an easy purchase and easy planting. And then, of course, think about what you already have in your yard, what those colors are in the spring in certain beds. You might want to add complementary colors in existing landscapes. And then the other thing is some of the bulb foliage gets pretty ugly after the bloom. So there are bulbs out there that you can buy with fancier foliage so that you don't have to disguise or distract to try to take away from that ugly foliage. Consider the design elements. You want to, once again, plant among existing landscape beds. So you want to plant into perennial shrubs and trees, and that way you have a longer, more diverse time of bloom in the spring. Think always power in masses. So you want to plant more than 12 bulbs. I know I've always been bad about putting a tulip here and then a tulip in another bed and a tulip in the backyard. No, you want to do 12 or more. That way you get that pow factor, that power in masses. And be selective, because if you go too hog wild, like I've been known to do, you want this and that and this and that. And you get a little bit of each one, and then you've just got a huge menagerie of colors, and it's just a little distracting. And so if you can plant in masses for the power, but be selective and make fewer variety choices, you can actually have more impact. One thing with tulips that I found very beneficial is you want to plant early, mid, and late blooming tulips to extend that bloom time. And so you will start very early in the spring, and you can maximize your tulip blooming time by anywhere between 6 to 12 weeks, just based on what you're putting in. And my recommendation is always go with the perennial tulips, or what we call the Darwin tulips, because you have a greater odds for them coming back unless critters get them. And that's one thing we always try to encourage people to cage them or plant them in a style that they won't be as apt for vole damage or squirrels or any number of critters. And then, of course, one I've already mentioned this one, fading foliage is ugly. Plan to disguise or distract, or so put those bulbs that are going to have the ugly foliage in areas where you have bloom right after the bulbs fade. On selecting the healthy bulbs, once again, I already mentioned this, but compare the local stores to online sources. One thing I like about the local sources is you can actually touch and feel the bulbs. And that way you can see if they're still fresh or they're deteriorating or they're starting to break down. Keep in mind that when you're shopping in these catalogs, as well as locally, sizes will vary by variety, and you want to buy the best size for the price. And as bulbs age from year to year to year, the bulb gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And some of these catalogs classify bulbs at different sizes. And so just because a bulb might cost you pennies on a dollar and it's like a couple sizes smaller, my advice is get the bigger bulb. Pay more on the price. That way that you can have a better show in the spring. So just because they're cheap doesn't mean you're going to get a good show. So compare sizes with prices, definitely. Some catalogs have the statement, all our bulbs are blooming size. So what is a blooming size bulb? And it goes back to what I just said. You can have a 2-year-old bulb that is relatively small. It will bloom, but the bloom is going to be inferior. But you could have a 4-year-old bulb and have a much bigger and brighter, more quality bloom. So just keep that in mind, that slogan doesn't always mean much. Take a look at price and size of the bulb. What are you paying for? Keep in mind that we have the harder bulbs, and then we also have fleshy bulbs. So just pay attention to when you're feeling these bulbs or you're looking in a catalog, when they ship them, just make sure there's no deterioration. If they're supposed to be fleshy, you don't want it to be slimy and mushy. You still want some firmness to it, but there can be a little give. But if it's a harder bulb, like a crocus bulb, like a hyacinth bulb, you don't want it to be squishy. You want it to be nice and firm. Small blemishes or little bits coming off doesn't really matter. It's not going to hurt. And little bits of mold, not a big problem. It's when they're completely dried out, if they're supposed to be fleshy, or completely mushy, if they're supposed to be fleshy. And then, if there's just deterioration and they're real light, nothing's there, that's when you don't want to buy them. And then I've had some bulbs that are supposed to be dried out. They're more of a corm. And so just keep that in mind. Bulbs can be hard. It's going back to the research and finding out what the bulbs are like before you're supposed to plant them. Just to give you a rundown quickly about timing of planting of bulbs, I'm talking about just selecting and buying your bulbs right now. So between now and probably the 3rd week of October, you should be ordering and storing them. And when you store them, they should be in a dry, cool place. And then once we hit about the second, third week of October, start thinking about planting. Here in Southeast Missouri, we can plant into November and December. The big thing is with planting, you want the ground to be cold. You don't want it insulated. You want it to be cold, because if the ground's too warm and you plant those bulbs, they'll sprout and come on up, and you do not want that. You can plant some of these bulbs as late as December and January, but when we get into February, we're starting to have that countdown. Most of these bulbs need about 9 weeks to 12 weeks of cold chilling time. And so when we get to February, like that first week of February, we're really starting to hurt on the number of days that you're going to get chilling. So that's why I always try to tell people, try to get them in the ground at the end of October to November. But if you forget about them, which I've done, then you can probably go as late as January and even the first week of February. If you get too far into February, they'll sprout, but they probably just won't bloom for you. And then just keep in mind, you can always force them indoors, and that's a whole nother topic. We won't get into that. And if you are going to mulch your beds, do it once the ground has cooled down and froze. And a lot of that, you're not going to be mulching until December, maybe latter part of November into December, into January. And that's because, once again, the cold soil will keep those bulbs from sprouting. And so putting any mulch when the soil is warm will only encourage them to come up faster.